found something in the woods 3 years ago that still keeps me up at night. My partner disappeared that day, and I barely made it out alive. What I'm about to share happened during the worst winter storm our region had seen in decades. And I know most people won't believe me, but I'm telling you this story anyway because the truth needs to be out there. I worked as a park ranger in the Cascade Mountains for almost 15 years. My partner and I had seen just about everything those mountains could throw at us. We'd rescued lost hikers in blizzards, dealt with aggressive wildlife, and pulled people out of situations they had no business getting into. We'd seen bear attacks, mountain lion encounters, people who'd gotten themselves hopelessly lost just 50 yards from a marked trail. We'd found bodies of hikers who'd underestimated the mountain's dangers. We'd rappelled down cliffs to retrieve injured climbers and trudged through waist-deep snow to bring out hypothermia victims. After 15 years, you think you've seen it all. You think you know every danger the wilderness can present, every trick nature has up its sleeve. You develop a kind of confidence and understanding that while the mountains are dangerous, they're also predictable. Animals behave in predictable ways. Weather follows patterns. Even the terrain, as treacherous as it can be, operates under consistent rules. But nothing prepared us for what we encountered that February morning. The storm had hit 2 days earlier. We'd been tracking it for almost a week, watching the weather reports with growing concern. When it finally arrived, it exceeded even the worst predictions. 3 feet of snow in less than 24 hours. Winds that peaked at over 80 miles per hour, strong enough to snap century-old pines like toothpicks. The Weather Service called it a once-in-a-generation event, the kind of storm that old-timers tell stories about decades later. We'd been stuck at the ranger station for 2 full days, watching through the windows as the world outside disappeared into a howling white void. The station creaked and groaned under the assault. Snow piled against the walls, burying the first-floor windows. We kept the fire going and rationed our supplies, knowing we might be stuck for days after the storm passed if the roads were impassable. By the time it passed, the entire mountain range had been transformed into something alien and hostile. Everything familiar was buried or altered. Landmarks we'd used for years were gone, hidden under drifts or toppled by the wind. The forest looked different, foreign, like we were seeing it for the first time. We headed out at dawn on foot to assess the damage along our usual patrol route. Standard post-storm protocol. We needed to check the main trails, look for downed trees blocking access roads, make sure no park structures had been compromised. We also needed to search for anyone who might have been caught out in the storm, though we prayed no one had been foolish enough to be in the backcountry when it hit. The morning was crystal clear, one of those impossibly beautiful post-storm days where the sky is so blue it almost hurts to look at. The temperature had dropped to well below zero, the kind of cold that burns your lungs with each breath and makes any exposed skin feel like it's being stabbed with tiny needles. Every exhalation created a cloud of frozen vapor that hung in the still air for a moment before dissipating. The world was unnaturally quiet. That should have been my first warning. After a big storm, you usually hear all kinds of sounds. Trees continuing to drop their snow loads with muffled thumps, branches cracking as they adjust to the weight, birds cautiously emerging from their shelters, small animals venturing out to search for food. But that morning, there was nothing. Complete silence except for the crunch of our boots in the snow and our labored breathing. Even those sounds seemed muffled, absorbed by the heavy snow cover. It was eerie, but I chalked it up to the severity of the storm. Maybe the wildlife was still hunkered down, waiting for things to return to normal. My partner was in good spirits that morning. We'd both been stuck at the ranger station during the storm, going stir-crazy, reading the same magazines over and over, playing cards until we were sick of them. He was glad to finally be out, moving, doing actual work instead of just waiting. He kept making jokes about how much paperwork we'd avoided by being snowed in, how maybe we should pray for storms more often if it meant dodging administrative duties. I remember laughing at something he said about filing expense reports versus fighting blizzards. It was a good moment, comfortable and easy. We'd worked together for 7 years at that point. We knew each other's rhythms, could communicate with just a glance. He was more than just a work partner, he was a friend. Then we rounded a bend in the trail and everything changed. That's when I saw the tracks. At first, I thought it was just some disturbance in the snow. Maybe a tree had fallen during the storm and its branches had created drag marks as it toppled. Or maybe an avalanche had swept through the section, leaving chaotic patterns in its wake. But as we got closer and stopped to get a better look, I realized these were footprints. Massive footprints. Each one was easily twice the size of my boot, maybe even 3 times. They were deep, pressed firmly into the snow, showing that whatever made them was incredibly heavy. But what struck me most was the shape. They weren't the rounded depressions of a bear's paws or the split hoof marks of elk or moose. These were distinctly foot-shaped, with what looked like 5 distinct toe impressions at the front. The tracks formed a clear walking pattern, 1 foot in front of the other, with a stride length that was longer than any human could manage. They led off the main trail and disappeared into the dense forest, cutting a path through snow that came up almost to my waist in places. My partner stopped walking beside me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, staring at the tracks. The only sound was our breathing, visible in white puffs in the frigid air. Finally, my partner broke the silence with a joke about moose. But I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, that slight tremor that told me he was as unsettled as I was. We'd both seen enough wildlife tracks to know what we were looking at didn't match anything familiar. These weren't moose tracks. Moose leave distinctive hoof prints, even in deep snow. They weren't elk for the same reason. They weren't bear tracks either. Bear tracks have claw marks and pad impressions that are unmistakable. And besides, bears should have been hibernating. The storm had been too recent for any bear to have woken up and wandered out here. What made these tracks even more unsettling was how deliberate they looked. The spacing was even, rhythmic. Whatever had made them was walking with purpose, not wandering aimlessly like an animal searching for food. It was going somewhere specific, moving with confidence through terrain that would have been treacherous for anything on 2 legs. I suggested we radio it in, let someone else deal with it. Maybe there was a logical explanation we weren't seeing. Maybe wildlife biologists would know what could leave tracks like this. But even as I said it, I knew how ridiculous it would sound over the radio. We found some weird footprints, send help. They'd think we were losing it. My partner was already moving toward the tracks for a closer look. Against my better judgment, I followed. We needed to at least figure out what we were dealing with before we reported anything. We decided to follow them. It seemed like the reasonable thing to do at the time, though looking back, it was probably the worst decision we could have made. We grabbed our rifles tighter and trudged into the forest. The snow was deep, almost up to our knees in places where the wind had created drifts. Following the tracks was slow, exhausting work. Every step required pulling our boots free from the snow, lifting our legs high, and plunging forward into the next drift. Within minutes, my thighs were burning from the effort, but the tracks were clear as day, easy to follow. Whatever had made them had carved a path through the forest that was almost like a trail. Branches were broken, undergrowth was trampled, and the footprints themselves were so deep and distinct that even in the shadow of the trees, we could see every detail. As we moved deeper into the forest, the sunlight faded. The canopy here was thick with evergreens that had held on to most of their snow. It was darker, colder, and the silence seemed even more oppressive. Our footsteps and heavy breathing were the only sounds. About 100 yards in, the tracks led us around a massive Douglas fir. Its trunk had to be at least 8 feet in diameter, ancient and weathered. As we came around it, my partner stopped so suddenly that I almost walked into him. That's when we saw it. The body was partially buried in a snowdrift, slumped against the base of another massive fir tree about 30 feet ahead. At first, my brain simply couldn't process what I was seeing. The size was all wrong. The proportions were impossible. It was too large to be human, but the shape was too human to be any animal I'd ever encountered. We both froze. My rifle suddenly felt both too heavy and completely inadequate in my hands. My partner made a sound, something between a gasp and a choke. Neither of us could speak. We just stood there, maybe 20 feet from the thing, staring. It was a Bigfoot. I know how that sounds. I know the immediate reaction most people have to that claim. But I'm telling you, there's no other way to describe what we saw. This wasn't a bear that had somehow been mistaken for something else. This wasn't a person in a suit. This was a creature that shouldn't exist, yet there it was, dead in the snow. The size alone was staggering. Even slumped against the tree, it was massive. If it had been standing, it would have been easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. The shoulders were incredibly broad, maybe 4 feet across. The arms were long, reaching down past where the knees would be, giving it proportions that were distinctly not human, even though the basic structure was humanoid. Its body was covered in dark fur, thick and matted. The fur was a deep brown-black color, darker in some places than others, and it was clearly designed for survival in brutal conditions. Even buried partially in snow and clearly dead for some time, the fur looked dense and substantial, the kind of insulation that could withstand the worst winter conditions. But it was the face that really got to me. That's what broke through the initial shock and made this real. The face was broad and flat, with features that were simultaneously human and utterly alien. The brow ridge was prominent, jutting forward over deep-set eyes. The nose was wide and flat, the nostrils large, the mouth hung slightly open, and I could see teeth that looked disturbingly human in their shape and arrangement. The bone structure of the face was complex and sophisticated. This wasn't a simple animal skull. There were cheekbones, a defined jaw, structure and architecture that suggested intelligence and complexity. Even in death, even with the eyes glazed and frozen, there was something in that face that looked far too knowing, far too aware. My partner finally found his voice. He asked if I was seeing what he was seeing. I told him yes. We stood there a moment longer, both of us trying to come to terms with the impossible thing in front of us. Then, slowly, carefully, we moved closer. Every step felt surreal, like we were moving through a dream. Part of my mind kept insisting this couldn't be real, that we'd made some kind of mistake, that there was a logical explanation we just weren't seeing yet. But the hands were what removed all doubt. The hands were enormous, the fingers as thick as sausages, but the basic structure was unmistakably human. 5 fingers on each hand, including opposable thumbs. The fingers had nails, not claws, thick and dark, but definitely nails. And on the palms and fingers, I could see patterns that looked like fingerprints, whorl patterns visible even through the leathery, weathered skin. This wasn't some bear standing upright. This wasn't a gorilla that had somehow wandered to North America. This was something else entirely, something that combined human and ape characteristics in ways that shouldn't be possible, but clearly were. The creature was clearly dead. There was no question about that. The eyes were open and glazed over, frozen in a fixed stare. A thin layer of frost had formed on the surface of the eyes, making them look cloudy and white. The body was stiff, frozen solid, probably had been for at least a day or more. Light snow had accumulated on the fur and face, suggesting it had been here since before the storm ended. The mouth was slightly open, and I could see the tongue dark and frozen. The teeth were remarkable, a mixture of flat molars for grinding and sharper canines, suggesting an omnivorous diet. Everything about this creature suggested it was real, biological, a living thing that had somehow existed in these mountains without anyone knowing. My partner and I just stood there for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few minutes. Neither of us speaking, both of us trying to wrap our minds around what we were seeing. The silence of the forest felt oppressive, heavy, like the weight of a secret that was too big to contain. My first instinct, my immediate reaction, was to get the hell out of there. We needed to report this to someone higher up the chain and let them deal with it. This was way above our pay grade, way beyond anything 2 park rangers should be handling. Everything about this felt wrong, like we were trespassing on something we weren't meant to see, witnessing something we had no right to know about. But my partner had different ideas. He started talking fast, excited. This was the discovery of a lifetime. Think about what this meant. Scientific proof of a creature that people had been hunting for decades. We'd be famous. Book deals, documentary appearances, never having to work another day in our lives. I tried to talk him down. This thing was massive. We had no idea how it died, what diseases it might be carrying, and more importantly, we had no right to move it. This needed to be handled by experts, by authorities, not by 2 park rangers on foot. But he was insistent. If we reported this, the government would swoop in, cordon off the area, and we'd never see a dime. They might even deny it existed, cover the whole thing up. This was our find. We discovered it. We had every right to it. The argument went back and forth. He wanted to move the body to our cabin immediately before scavengers got to it or more snow buried it. I said it was too heavy, too dangerous, too unknown. How were we supposed to move something that probably weighed 500 pounds through deep snow? That's when he proposed the plan. He'd go back to the cabin and get the cargo sled we used for supply runs, bring back rope, tarps, everything we'd need. I'd stay here and guard the body, make sure nothing disturbed it. He estimated 2 hours, maybe less, round trip. I didn't like it. Something about the whole situation made my skin crawl. But he was my partner. We'd worked together for years, trusted each other with our lives. And maybe some small part of me was curious about what this thing really was. So I agreed. He headed back toward the trail. I watched him disappear into the trees, listened to the sound of his footsteps crunching through the snow, getting fainter and fainter. And then I was alone in the forest with a dead Bigfoot. The silence hit me immediately. It wasn't just quiet, it was the absence of sound. No birds, no wind rustling branches, no distant sounds of the forest. Just complete, oppressive silence. The kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing. I positioned myself about 20 feet from the body, rifle across my lap, and tried to get comfortable. The temperature was well below freezing, and sitting still wasn't going to help. I started doing small movements to keep my blood flowing, flexing my fingers inside my gloves, shifting my weight from foot to foot. Time moved slowly. I kept checking my watch, convinced that at least 30 minutes had passed, only to find it had been 5. To keep my mind occupied, I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe this was just a really large primate that had somehow made it to North America. Maybe it was sick, died of natural causes, and just happened to look like the legendary Bigfoot. But the more I looked at it, the less that explanation made sense. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. After sitting there for what felt like forever but was probably only 20 minutes, I needed to move. Needed to do something other than just watch and wait. The cold was starting to seep through my layers, and I knew I couldn't sit still much longer without risking hypothermia. I moved closer to the creature, crouching down beside it. This close, I could see even more details that had been hidden from a distance. The skin where it wasn't covered by fur was dark, almost black, and looked thick and leathery. There were old scars visible on the arms and chest, pale lines against the darker skin, suggesting this thing had lived a hard life even before whatever killed it. The fur was coarse and wiry, nothing like bear fur, which is typically softer and more uniform. This was matted in places, tangled with bits of pine needles and small twigs and debris from the forest. It smelled too, not strongly because of the cold, but there was definitely an odor, musky, animal, but with something else underneath. Not unpleasant exactly, just unfamiliar. The face up close was even more remarkable than from a distance. Even in death, there was something intelligent about it. The eyes, though glazed and frozen, had an expressiveness to them that animal eyes simply don't have. The sockets were deep, the bone structure around them complex. This thing had brow ridges, real cheekbones, a defined jaw with muscle attachment points that spoke of a sophisticated facial structure. The more I looked, the more details I noticed. The ears were small and set close to the head, almost human in shape, but positioned slightly differently. The nose, despite being flat and broad, had structure to it, cartilage and bone that gave it form. The lips were thin, pulled back slightly in death to reveal those unsettling teeth. I looked at the hands again, unable to resist examining them more closely. They were absolutely remarkable. The proportions were off compared to human hands. Everything was massive, and the fingers were longer in relation to the palm, but the basic anatomy was identical to mine. Opposable thumbs that clearly had the same range of motion as human thumbs. Fingernails rather than claws, thick and dark, but definitely nails, even showing the same kind of ridges and texture. And the palms, when I gently turned one of the hands, showed clear lines and creases. Not just random patterns, but distinct palm lines, even what looked like fingerprints on the pads of the fingers. This level of detail, this kind of sophisticated structure, you don't get that from a hoax or a costume. This was real biological tissue, a real hand, just scaled up to impossible proportions. That's when I started wondering what had killed it. Looking at something this large, this powerfully built, it was hard to imagine what could have brought it down. This creature looked like it could have snapped a person in half without much effort. The muscle definition visible through the fur suggested tremendous strength. So what had killed it? I searched for obvious wounds, expecting to find gunshots or deep lacerations, something that would explain its death. Maybe a hunter had shot it, panicked when they realized what they'd killed, and fled without reporting it. Or maybe it had gotten in a fight with another large predator, a bear or mountain lion, and succumbed to its injuries. But there was no blood in the snow around the body. The snow was disturbed where the creature had fallen or been dragged, but it was clean, white, pristine. No blood trail leading to the spot, no arterial spray patterns, nothing to suggest a bleeding wound. Looking at the visible side of the body, I couldn't see any obvious injuries. The fur looked intact, no patches of missing hair or visible wounds. Maybe it had died from disease or old age. But it didn't look old. The muscle tone was good, the teeth looked strong and healthy, none of the signs of advanced age you'd expect to see. I needed to see the other side. With some effort, bracing my legs and using all my strength, I managed to roll the creature slightly away from the tree. The body was incredibly heavy, easily several hundred pounds, and frozen solid, which made it even harder to move. But I got it rolled far enough to see the other side. That's when I saw the damage, and everything changed. The entire right side of the torso was a mess. Massive bruising was visible even through the thick fur. dark discoloration spreading across the rib cage. The ribs themselves were clearly broken, the chest cavity crushed inward on one side. I could see where individual ribs had snapped, creating unnatural angles beneath the skin. The arms showed similar damage, dark bruising on the shoulders and upper arms, the kind you'd see from extreme blunt force trauma. And the head had a massive dent above the left ear, a depression in the skull where bone had fractured inward. These weren't cuts or bites, these were impact injuries. Something had beaten this creature to death with incredible force. The kind of force that could shatter bones that had to be thick and dense to support an 8-foot frame. The kind of force that could cave in a skull that probably had a bone structure strong enough to withstand falling branches and charging through underbrush. I stood up, my heart racing. This Bigfoot hadn't died of natural causes. It had lost a fight, a brutal, one-sided fight. And the implications of that were terrifying. What could do this to something this large and powerful? A bear? Number. Bears bite and claw. They don't deliver precise, crushing blows. A human? Impossible. No human could generate this kind of force, and even if they could, why would they leave the body here? The only explanation that made sense was another Bigfoot. The thought hit me like a physical blow. These creatures fight each other, violently, brutally, and whatever had killed this one might still be in the area, might be territorial, might be watching me right now. That's when I heard it. The sound came from somewhere deep in the forest, distant but unmistakable. It was a roar, but unlike anything I'd ever heard. Too deep for a bear, too primal for anything human. The sound vibrated through my chest, triggering something instinctive and ancient in my brain. Pure fear. I grabbed my rifle and stood perfectly still, listening. The forest was still silent except for that roar which echoed and faded. Then, after maybe 30 seconds, it came again. Closer this time, maybe half a mile away. My mind raced through the possibilities. Another Bigfoot had killed this one. The winner of that fight was out there, and if it was territorial, if it was still aggressive, I was in serious danger. A third roar split the air, definitely closer. I made my decision in an instant. Partner or no partner, I needed to leave. Now. I started back toward the trail, trying to move quickly through the deep snow. Every step was an effort, my boots sinking and requiring me to pull them free for the next step. I kept my rifle ready, constantly scanning the tree line. The roar came again, and this time I could tell it was coming from the direction of our cabin. My stomach dropped. My partner had headed that way. Was he okay? Had he encountered whatever was making that sound? I fumbled for my radio, yanked it from my belt, and tried to raise him. Nothing but static. Either he was out of range, or something was interfering with the signal, or his radio was off. None of those options were good. I picked up my pace, half running, half stumbling through the snow. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning from the effort. Behind me, I heard another roar, and this time I could swear it was closer than before. I came around a bend in the trail and saw something dark in the snow ahead, a splash of color against the endless white. My first thought, my desperate hope, was that my partner had returned early. Maybe he'd realized how dangerous this was and come back before making it all the way to the cabin. Maybe he'd be standing there with our cargo sled ready to help me get the hell out of these woods. Relief started to flood through me at the thought, but as I got closer, stumbling and half running through the deep snow, that relief turned to ice-cold dread. It wasn't my partner, it wasn't the sled, it was his rifle lying in the middle of the trail. I stopped dead, my own rifle raised, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The rifle was lying at an angle, half buried in the snow. Even from a distance, I could see it was damaged. As I approached cautiously, I could see the stock was cracked, a clean break that spoke of tremendous force. The scope had been ripped clean off, leaving twisted metal and exposed screws where it had been mounted. My partner loved that rifle. He'd saved for months to buy it, spent hours at the range perfecting his aim with it. He would never have left it behind voluntarily. The fact that it was here, damaged and abandoned in the snow, meant something terrible had happened. 20 feet further down the trail, I found his backpack. But it wasn't just lying there neatly. The contents were scattered across a wide area, spread across maybe 30 feet of trail. His radio was smashed, the screen shattered into spiderweb cracks, and the casing split open. Batteries spilled out into the snow. His water bottle had been crushed completely flat, like someone had stepped on it with immense force. The metal so compressed it looked like a disc. His first aid kit had burst open, bandages and supplies scattered and half buried in the snow. The snow around the area was churned up violently, showing signs of a struggle. Not just disturbed, but absolutely destroyed. It looked like a battle had taken place here. The snow was kicked up and thrown around, creating chaotic patterns. And on the trees nearby, I could see gouges in the bark. Deep, parallel marks that could only have been made by claws dragged down the trunks with such force they'd ripped away layers of bark and exposed the white wood beneath. The gouges were massive, the spacing between the individual claw marks wider than my hand could span. Whatever had made those marks had claws that were huge and incredibly sharp. And the depth of the gouges suggested tremendous strength, the kind of force that could have torn those trees apart if it had wanted to. I called out his name. My voice sounded thin and scared in the silence of the forest, echoing off the trees and fading into nothing. I called again, louder this time, desperately hoping for a response. Maybe he was hurt, maybe he was nearby, maybe he could hear me. But there was no response. Just that oppressive silence, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the thundering of my heart in my chest. The forest felt like it was watching me, waiting to see what I would do next. Then I saw the drag marks. They led off the trail into the thick timber, cutting a swath through the undergrowth that was impossible to miss. Something had dragged something heavy through here, and recently. The snow was pushed aside, branches were broken, and I could see where whatever it was had carved a path through the forest. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around, to get back to the trail and get help as fast as I could. To radio this in, to bring back reinforcements with better weapons and more people. This was beyond stupid, following a trail into the woods that clearly led to something dangerous, something that had already attacked my partner. But he was my partner, my friend, my colleague for 7 years. If there was any chance he was still alive, any chance at all that I could help him, I had to try. I followed the drag marks into the trees, my rifle held tight against my shoulder, safety off, finger resting on the trigger guard. Every shadow could be hiding something, every patch of darkness between the trees could conceal a threat. My eyes darted constantly, trying to watch every direction at once, knowing it was impossible but unable to stop myself from trying. The trail was clear and disturbingly obvious. Whatever had done this was strong beyond comprehension. The drag marks showed where something massive had moved through the forest, breaking branches that were inches thick, pushing through undergrowth that would have been impassable for a person. Young trees were snapped off at waist height. Bushes were crushed flat. It was a path of destruction that spoke of raw, terrifying power. About 30 feet in, caught on a branch about chest height, I found his jacket. Not just caught, but torn. The heavy winter jacket that was supposed to be nearly indestructible was shredded. The fabric was ripped in long, parallel gashes, the insulation pulled out and scattered across the snow. There were dark stains on what remained of the jacket, stains that I didn't want to think about but couldn't ignore. I touched the jacket with shaking hands, noting how the tears went completely through the thick material. Whatever had done this had claws that could slice through heavy winter gear like it was tissue paper, and the tears were high up, suggesting whatever had grabbed him had been tall, much taller than a person. I kept following the trail even though my hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep my rifle steady. My breath was coming in short, panicked gasps. The cold air burned my lungs, but I barely noticed. Every muscle in my body was tensed, ready to run or fight, my entire being focused on survival. My mind kept flashing to images I didn't want to see. The dead Bigfoot back there, with its crushed ribs and fractured skull. The massive hands that could have easily inflicted that damage. What those hands could do to a human body. What my partner might be going through right now if he was still alive. The drag marks continued deeper into the forest, leading upslope toward rockier terrain. I found more of his equipment scattered along the way, each piece another piece of evidence that painted a horrifying picture. His gloves torn and bloody, his knife still in its sheath but somehow ripped from his belt, pieces of his clothing, each one more torn and bloodied than the last. Each discovery made my chest tighter, made it harder to breathe. I was hyperventilating, I realized, and forced myself to slow down, to take deeper breaths. Panicking would get me killed. I needed to stay calm, stay focused, keep moving. The trail of scattered equipment stretched over maybe 100 yards, each piece telling part of a story I didn't want to complete in my mind. My partner had clearly tried to fight back, or at least tried to escape. But whatever had grabbed him had been too strong, too fast, too overwhelming. The trail led to a small clearing ahead. I could see where the trees opened up, where more light filtered down through the canopy. And I could see that the snow there was disturbed, churned up even from this distance. Something had happened in that clearing, something violent and final. I approached slowly, my rifle raised, every sense on high alert. When I reached the edge of the clearing and saw what was there, I stopped dead. The snow in the clearing was completely destroyed, not just disturbed, but obliterated. It looked like a bomb had gone off. The snow was churned into a chaotic mess, mixed with dirt and broken branches and blood. So much blood. There were spray patterns on the trees, dark spatters against the bark. The snow was trampled and torn up in a wide area, showing where something had happened, something violent and final. But there was no body, no sign of my partner except for the blood and the torn equipment. The drag marks continued on the other side of the clearing, leading upslope toward a rocky area dense with fallen timber. I stood at the edge of that clearing, torn between following the trail and running for my life. He could still be alive. He could be up there, hurt, needing help. But everything in my body was telling me that following that trail would be the last thing I ever did. I took one step toward the continued drag marks, then I heard it. Heavy breathing, not mine, coming from upslope, from somewhere in the trees above the clearing. Deep, rhythmic breaths, something huge drawing air in and out of massive lungs. I froze, rifle raised, scanning the tree line. At first I saw nothing, just trees and shadows and snow. But then I heard movement, branches breaking, snow falling from disturbed limbs. Something was up there. Something massive was moving through the trees parallel to my position. I started backing away slowly, keeping my rifle pointed upslope. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst. Every muscle in my body was tensed, ready to run at the slightest provocation. Then I saw movement between the trees, a shadow darker than the surrounding darkness. It was massive, easily 9 or 10 feet tall. Bipedal. Moving with a deliberate, confident grace through terrain that would have had me stumbling and falling. For just a moment, I caught a glimpse of its eyes. They were reflecting what little light filtered through the canopy, glowing with an intelligence that was somehow worse than animal aggression. This thing knew I was there. It was watching me, considering me. Then it roared. The sound was so loud, so close that I felt it in my bones. It wasn't just a roar, it was a statement, a warning. This was its territory, and I was trespassing. The message was clear: leave or die. I ran. I crashed through the forest, abandoning any pretense of caution or stealth. My only thought was to reach the trail and run back to the cabin as fast as I could. I could hear pursuit behind me, heavy footfalls, breaking branches, the sounds of something large moving fast through the trees. It was faster than me. Even in the deep snow, even with me running on pure adrenaline, it was faster. I could hear it getting closer, could almost feel its presence behind me. My mind kept flashing to the dead Bigfoot, to the crushed ribs and fractured skull, to what those massive hands could do to a human body. I burst onto the trail, my lungs burning. Behind me, I heard another roar, very close. The trees at the edge of the trail were shaking. I didn't look back, I just ran. My legs pumped through the snow, every step an agony of effort. The trail was easier than the forest, but still deep with snow. I slipped and fell twice, scrambling back to my feet with panic giving me strength I didn't know I had. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes of running, I risked a glance back. Just once. It was standing in the middle of the trail behind me, maybe 100 yards back. Massive, easily 9 or 10 feet tall, broader than 3 men standing side by side. Its fur was dark, almost black, and it stood perfectly still, watching me. What terrified me most was that it wasn't chasing me anymore. It just stood there, as if it knew it could catch me anytime it wanted, but had decided to let me go, like a warning, like a message. I turned and kept running, not slowing down until I could see the cabin in the distance. I made it back to the cabin, running most of the way, walking only when my lungs were burning so badly I thought I might pass out. When I finally stumbled up to the building, I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. I staggered inside, locked every door and window, and grabbed the shotgun we kept for emergencies. My hands were still shaking as I reached for the radio. It took 3 tries to get the right frequency. When dispatch finally answered, I could barely get the words out. Dead Bigfoot, partner missing, attacked, need help immediately. The dispatcher sounded skeptical, but something in my voice must have convinced her this was serious. She said help was on the way. Sheriff's deputies, search and rescue, they were mobilizing everyone. But it would take 90 minutes to get a team together and reach our location. 90 minutes. I had to wait 90 minutes alone in that cabin, knowing that thing was out there. I positioned myself by the window with the shotgun across my lap and waited. Every sound made me jump. The cabin settling, ice cracking on the roof, tree branches scraping against the walls. My imagination turned every noise into approaching footsteps, every shadow into something lurking outside. At one point, I heard something heavy moving around the perimeter of the cabin. Footsteps in the snow, definitely bipedal, definitely large. I gripped the shotgun tighter and waited, sweat running down my face despite the cold. The footsteps circled the building once, then faded into the distance. Those 90 minutes were the longest of my life. When help finally arrived, I'd never been so relieved to see other people. Multiple rangers, sheriff's deputies, search and rescue volunteers. They took one look at me and knew something serious had happened. I led them back to where we'd found the body. The trek seemed shorter in daylight with a dozen armed men around me. But when we reached the spot, my stomach sank. The dead Bigfoot was gone, completely gone. The snow where it had been was disturbed, showing where something large had been dragged away, but the body itself was nowhere to be found. Some of the men looked at me skeptically, but others were studying the tracks, the disturbed snow, the clear signs that something massive had been there. We found my partner's rifle right where I'd seen it. His backpack and scattered equipment were still there. The clearing with all the blood was exactly as I'd described. One of the deputies took photos, bagged some of the bloody snow as evidence. They brought in tracking dogs. The dogs followed my partner's scent to the clearing, then went crazy, whining, pulling at their leashes, trying to go anywhere but further up that trail. Their handlers had never seen them act like that before. Eventually, they had to take the dogs back. They were too spooked to be of any use. The search continued for 3 days. They brought in helicopters, more volunteers, search and rescue teams from neighboring counties. They combed every inch of that mountain, but they never found my partner's body. They never found any trace of the Bigfoot, living or dead. After 3 days, with weather moving in again, they called off the search. The official report listed my partner as missing, presumed dead, possible animal attack. They took samples of the blood from the clearing. The lab results came back inconclusive. Not bear, not mountain lion, not human. Just inconclusive. They couldn't identify what species the blood came from. I tried to tell them the full story. The dead Bigfoot, the injuries showing it had been in a fight, the living Bigfoot that had taken my partner. But the more I talked, the more skeptical everyone became. They suggested I'd been suffering from stress, from hypothermia, from shock at finding my partner's equipment. One psychologist gently explained that the human brain, when confronted with trauma, sometimes creates narratives to help process what happened. Maybe I'd seen a bear, and my mind had transformed it into something else. Maybe the stress of the situation had caused me to misremember details. The official theory was that my partner had been attacked by a large predator, probably a bear that had woken up early from hibernation. The body was dragged off and scavenged. The blood they found supported this theory. The fact that they couldn't identify the species was just a limitation of the tests, not evidence of anything unusual. As for the dead Bigfoot I claimed to have seen, well, there was no evidence it had ever existed. I must have misidentified something else. Maybe a dead bear, maybe a fallen tree with moss that looked like fur in my panicked state. The mind plays tricks in stressful situations. I was put on administrative leave, mandatory counseling sessions. Everyone was very understanding, very sympathetic. They told me that survivor's guilt was normal, that blaming myself for not being there when my partner was attacked was a natural reaction. The case went cold within a few weeks. 3 weeks after my partner disappeared, a hiker found something strange. He was on a trail about 5 miles from where the incident occurred, on the opposite side of the mountain. Caught in a tree branch, about 15 feet off the ground, was my partner's ranger badge. There was no explanation for how it got there. The hiker said he'd been on that trail dozens of times and never seen it before. It was just suddenly there, hanging from a branch that was far too high for any human to reach without a ladder. They returned the badge to me at a small ceremony. His family was there. They thanked me for trying to find him, for staying with him as long as I could. They didn't blame me for surviving when he didn't. I keep that badge on my desk now. I look at it every day and remember. Because I know the truth, even if no one believes me. I took early retirement 6 months later. I couldn't go back to those mountains, couldn't patrol those trails knowing what was out there. I moved to the coast, as far from that forest as I could get while staying in the state. My partner's family never got closure. There was no body to bury, no real explanation for what happened. The official cause of death was listed as missing, presumed dead due to animal attack. His name is on a memorial plaque at the ranger station now. I still have nightmares, not about finding the dead Bigfoot, though that was disturbing enough. Not even about seeing all that blood in the clearing, though that haunts me too. No, my nightmares are about those eyes in the trees, about the way that creature stood at the edge of the trail and watched me leave, about the intelligence I saw there and the cold calculation. It let me go. That's what I can't stop thinking about. It could have caught me easily, could have done to me what it did to my partner, but it chose to let me leave. Whether it was a warning or mercy or just indifference, I'll never know. Sometimes I wonder if I should have fought harder to make people believe me. If I should have demanded more extensive searches, pushed for better explanations of that blood sample, insisted that something was living in those mountains that we didn't understand. But then I think about that roar, about the sound of something massive moving through the trees, about the crushed ribs and fractured skull of the dead Bigfoot, about the spray patterns of blood in that clearing. And I think maybe it's better that people don't believe me. Maybe it's better that this stays a mystery, that those mountains keep their secrets. Because if people knew what was really out there, if they understood what those creatures were capable of, there would be hunting parties and expeditions and chaos. And then more people would die. More families would lose someone they loved. More partners would disappear into the forest, never to be seen again. So I keep quiet mostly. I tell this story occasionally, like I'm telling it now, and people listen politely and then move on with their lives. They file it away as an interesting tale, maybe a trauma-induced hallucination, maybe just a good campfire story. But I know what I saw, I know what happened to my partner, and I know that there are things in those mountains that don't want to be found. Things that are smart enough, strong enough, and brutal enough to make sure they stay hidden. Things that will kill to protect their territory and their secrets. I'll never go back to those mountains. I'll never know exactly what happened to my partner in his final moments. But I'll always remember standing in that cabin, waiting for help to arrive, knowing that something was circling outside in the darkness. I'll always remember those eyes in the trees, watching me with an intelligence that still makes my blood run cold. And I'll always remember that badge hanging 15 feet up in a tree where no human could have placed it. A message, maybe, or a trophy, or just a reminder that there are things in this world we don't understand, and some of them are better left alone. That's my story. Believe it or not, that's up to you. But if you ever find yourself in those mountains, in deep snow and thick forest, and you hear a roar that doesn't sound like any animal you know, do yourself a favor. Turn around. Leave. Don't investigate. Don't try to get a closer look. Because some things are better left undiscovered, and some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved. For more interesting stories, check this out.